Welcome to the South Asia Solidarity Group webinar on Sri Lanka, this webinar on Sri Lanka. This is hopefully the first of a series of meetings we are going to hold this year on Sri Lanka. And we have three outstanding speakers today who have been researching, writing, and campaigning around the issues that they are going to speak on and present today. We hope that their insights and expertise will set the stage for the series of meetings that SASG is planning for the rest of the year. And by way of a few introductory remarks, I just want to say that right across the South Asian region, we see the deepening of crippling economic crises, rise of majoritarianism, targeting and persecution of minorities, the consolidation of authoritarian rule through the spawning of extremist right-wing ethno-nationalist and fascist movements, militarization, and most importantly, the whole process of becoming trapped within a neoliberal economic framework that causes dispossession and impoverishment and facilitates corporate plunder and severe indebtedness to global financial forces. Sri Lanka exemplifies many of these really deleterious trends plaguing the various nations of South Asia. It is in this backdrop that we have to view the Sri Lankan president's recent chilling comments that he does not need to only play the role of a constitutional president, but he can return to his erstwhile military role during the end of the civil war 10 years ago when tens of thousands of innocent Tamil civilians were slaughtered. This is a warning, I presume. This current government's authoritarian rule, which is being consolidated through constitutional, legal, but also extra-parliamentary measures, is characterized by a singular Buddhist nationalist ideological ethos, where minorities are increasingly marginalized. The demolition of a memorial 2 nights ago for the war dead built inside the University of Jaffna and the ongoing forcible cremations of Muslim dead persons who died with or without COVID infections has caused immense suffering and trauma for people in the Muslim community. All such measures against minority communities are on the increase. It is not just that the minorities that are targeted. The poor in the South and across the country are going to clamor against the declining standard of living and increasing poverty. The government's militarized handling of the COVID crisis has created new problems. The recent massacre in Mahara prison of inmates by the armed forces, as they protested overcrowding and the fast spread of the coronavirus within the prison, is an example. The new government in Sri Lanka consolidated power in 2020 with the promise of economic development and a more what shall I say, technocratic disciplined and technocratic society. This meant that Sri Lanka needed a strong man to achieve it, vested with extraordinary powers to the detriment of democracy. The majoritarian agenda of successive Sri Lankan governments has been stepped up to an all-time high in 2020. The voters from the majority community were wooed openly with the slogan that the regime needed a 2/3 majority to spearhead economic development and to discipline querulous minority communities into submission. Since its inception, the new regime has triggered unprecedented levels of politicization of the administrative organs of the state and the judiciary in the service of the all-powerful executive. The 20th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution, which became law recently, consolidates virtual all-state power in the hands of the president, rendering even parliament a subordinate institution. As animosities towards the Tamil minority continue to simmer, nationalist forces backed by the majority and state have turned their attention to the other minority, the Muslim community. For people like me, there is a sense of deja vu when Muslims like Tamils before are scapegoated, subjected to pogroms, and are detained indefinitely without charge under anti-terror legislation, especially since the Easter Sunday terror attacks in 2019. The most flagrant display of breach of human rights recently has been the forcible cremation of the bodies of Muslims who have died or are suspected to have died of the COVID virus against their religious beliefs and against established scientific principles. While the government targets minorities, the inadequacy, its inadequacy is clearly exposed, mostly on the economic front. That is at the heart of the problems facing Sri Lanka today. The coronavirus pandemic has accelerated this national economic crisis, and the extensive marketing borrowing by successive governments has now met with an inevitable end, it seems. With incomes falling, the government is facing a serious crisis of balance of payments. And there is no money for pandemic relief for the population. And with the failure to meet this, the country is facing huge crisis with regard to meeting international debt obligations this year. And this is something maybe our speakers will deal with. And all of this has been accompanied, as I have said, through the centralization of power and culminating in this current authoritarian government. And I think as the economic crisis gets worse, I think the authoritarian strategies of the state, of the government, of this government will deepen. And that's the only way they will know how to deal with this. And the militarization process, which started during the Civil War, has never been dismantled. And it is continuing, and the pandemic is being used as a pretext to further militarize the country. While minorities suffer and protest, there is growing disaffection in the rest of the country, especially in the South, as life has become intolerable for ordinary workers, farmers, students, and the poor, as the prices rise and total deprivation sets in. So I just want to say, I want to make two announcements. And before that, I just want to say that we at South Asia Solidarity, we have already made our condemnation public. We have sent solidarity messages to protesters against the forced cremation of Muslim dead persons. But we also utterly condemn the militarized handling of the memorial within the Jaffna University 2 nights ago. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the buildings or building of a memorial, people have to memorialize their dead, especially when they died in such large numbers. The government has to provide space for that, especially when they do all the triumphal celebration of the war victory 11 years ago. But and people have to be allowed the space to mourn their dead and to memorialize it. And whatever the rights and wrongs of it within Jaffna, what happened within Jaffna University, the militarized handling of demolishing it, we utterly condemn it. That is not the way to deal with these issues. One, two, and of course, the second, this is something that we want to make clear. And also, I want to make two announcements before we start, about our upcoming events. One is, the first is on Sunday the 24th. On Sunday the 24th, we will be holding a 2-session panel discussion online Sunday from 2 to 5 p.m. on the theme of resisting fascism globally. And the event is being held ahead of India's Republic Day and will focus on, firstly, highlighting connections between Modi's Hindu supremacist fascism and corporate capital globally, as epitomized by the current massive farmers' movement resisting corporatization of agriculture. Secondly, the second issue will be left strategies for fighting fascism. And the speakers will be journalist P. Sainath, Kavita Krishnan, Indian feminist and left leader from the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist, Socialist Seattle Council member Shama Savant from the US, a speaker from Bolivia from the Cochabamba water privatization movement, and a representative of Jeremy Corbyn's new Peace and Justice Project. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram for more details, as we will be publicizing the details. I just wanted to announce this first before, so that we don't forget it at the end of the discussion. You can type your questions or raise your hand for questions. And also the other thing is we are also organizing a second session on Sri Lanka towards the end of February. We have penciled in a date. Some speakers have been confirmed, and we shall be publicizing the details very soon. So keep watching the space. Right. So now we will have the first speaker to speak today is Farzana Haniffa. Fara, she's known to many of us. She is a professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Colombo. Fara has spoken on one of our South Asian panels before, University of Colombo. Her research and activist interests have concentrated on the social and political history of Muslim communities, on gender politics and education reform in Sri Lanka. In 2016, Fara was appointed by the Prime Minister's Office to the Consultation Task Force on Reconciliation Mechanisms. She was visiting fellow in Commonwealth Studies at the Center for South Asian Studies at the University of Cambridge in 2018-19, and a visiting research fellow at Leibniz Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin in 2016. Fara serves on the Management Council of the Social Scientists Association Sri Lanka, the Board of Directors of the Law and Society Trust, and is a trustee of the Neelan Tirichelvam Trust in Sri Lanka. Fara Haniffa, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nirmala, and thank you for this invitation to speak. Now, as Nirmala pointed out, things are pretty dire in Sri Lanka, and my brief today has been to talk a little bit about the sort of ongoing anti-minority politics, and a little bit about the history of that under particularly the Rajapaksas. Now, anti-minority politics has been is part of a fundamental part of the Rajapaksa brand. But anti-minority politics is nothing new for Sri Lanka, and it has been sort of like the go-to way of doing politics, either for electoral reasons, to win elections, or as deflection from other kinds of problems that have been ongoing, right? And, for instance, we all know that one of the first acts of the newly independent state in 1948 was stripping away of citizenship of close to 800,000 people from the upcountry Tamil community, and thereby disenfranchising that population that already had the vote. So, this set the tone for anti-minority politics in Sri Lanka from the get-go. Now also, if you're talking about the history of ethnic conflict, it's also rife with moments at which the Sinhala leadership provoked the Tamil leadership, and then there was a response, and then there's the radicalization of youth for violence. And, it goes on and on, right? So, ironically, or perhaps sort of understandably in some sense, there is that pattern that is being sort of like restated with regards to Muslims since the end of the war in 2009. So I want to just say a little bit about the emergence and the sort of organization around the anti-Muslim movement after the war, because there is a sense in which, especially this is for my Sri Lankan audience here, especially there is a sense as if the sort of the anti-minority or the anti-Muslim sentiment that has sort of gripped the Sinhala population mainly in the south of the country is somehow organic and somehow sort of like, a natural response to sort of relationships between ethnic communities. And I'd like to emphasize the fact that it really isn't. It was part of a very organized movement that began at the end of 2012. Now in 2012, the BBS, the Bodubala Sena, this sort of the flag bearer of what I call the anti-Muslim movement, held a closed meeting for which only Sinhala Buddhists were invited at the end of 2012. And a colleague who attended provided notes to us to those of us who couldn't attend. And then in 2013, they launched their public campaign with massive public rallies all around the country. And in March 2013, launched the Halal Campaign. Now, the Halal Campaign has sort of like, is something that many people remember because it was, it was countrywide and it sort of incited a lot of reactions from a variety of people. And so what I noticed when I was documenting the Halal Campaign was that there seemed to be evidence of a sort of a coordinated campaign across the monks' massive meetings that they called in public areas, then the sort of the social media rollout of the campaign, and also newspaper coverage. So they shared the same information, they shared the same tropes, and there was a clear coordination, right? So then that happens in March 2013, and then in June 2014, we have Arulingam, the violence in Arulingam. Now in 2014, with the change of government, we thought that that was the end of things, but clearly the Sri Lanka Pudujana Peramuna continued to organize and strategize and work at the community level, and the rhetoric on social media continued. Now, the 2015 Yahapalne government, Muslims take pride in bringing it to power by the sort of the consolidated way in which they voted the Rajapaksas out. Okay. But of course, in 2018, the local government elections, the SLPP won resoundingly, and in the aftermath of the local government elections, there was violence in Kandy. Now, what a lot of people told us when we were researching in the aftermath of the violence was also that those who organized for the government, organized for the elections from the SLPP were present among the attackers, and many of the people who went to jail during that time, and they were arrested under the ICCPR and jailed for a really long time, were organizers for the SLPP, right? So there was a real concerted, clear effort by the SLPP to mobilize people on a very sort of anti-minority or anti-Muslim platform, and the sort of the violence was an expression of that sort of victory in some sense, right? And a lot of people were very clear that that is what it was. Now, of course, after the Easter Sunday attacks, the the anti-Muslim movement's rhetoric got sort of like solidified and legitimized by the government in power, because in a few weeks after, the president granted the Venerable Jnanasara pardon. He was in jail for something else, not related to the anti-Muslim sentiment that he had incited and organized around, but for contempt of court. And he was pardoned, right? So the pardoning was sort of like an indication that the anti-Muslim movement was actually being commended for somehow sort of naming the occurrence of that thing, of that sort of incident of the bombings of April 2019. Now, okay, so now I'll shift from there to talking about the sort of the COVID-related crisis in Sri Lanka right now. Now, as Nirmala said, there is this very troubling phenomenon of the government refusing to recognize Muslims' rights to bury their dead, the dead from the COVID, right? Now, it's very clear internationally, there is no sort of scientific evidence to indicate that there is any danger of burials, and burials are being done throughout the world. And also recently, a very sort of a considered report was released by a panel of experts stating that under very strict conditions, if burials were carried out, there wouldn't be a problem. And that they sort of justified their stance by saying that, while it was okay at that particular moment when the government proposed the cremations as compulsory, that during that time, the science was such that that was permitted, and that maybe to revisit now since the science had moved, right? So a very conciliatory kind of sort of statement of, how this should be taken forward. So, everyone hailed this report as, done by very well-known virologists and very well, highly respected members of the medical community. But now what is happening is that the government is kind of sort of like distancing itself from this report, and is saying that they are not going to move on this position of cremations, compulsory cremations. So for me, this is very interesting and a very interesting development in relation to sort of the militarization also that is ongoing in Sri Lanka, right? Because I mean, usually the politics in Sri Lanka is such that there is a, when there is a sort of like a clear indication of a shift, even in the sort of the sentiment of sort of a majority of Sinhalese that this should be permitted, the government generally concedes, and it seemed like heading towards that. But the sort of the government now establishing itself and saying that it won't do it is really concerning, because it seems as if the normal way in which politics was done was not being carried out anymore either. There are all these conversations about how within the sort of the regime itself there are many different opinions on this, but the one that seems to be prominent now is to refuse the burial. So refuse the burial rights, and that seems to be an indication of the government digging its heels in and saying that we are not going to shift for any reason. This doesn't seem to be a sort of a thought through rational position, rather a statement of the power that the government currently holds, that it doesn't want to be challenged on. Right? So for me, this is very indicative of the authoritarianism that is becoming more and more ingrained in the everyday kind of actions that we see from the government. So I think this is a real cause for concern, the way in which they are sort of stepping away from the committee, because I think that there is also some political fallout that they can expect from this. And the way in which they are not taking that political fallout into consideration, I think is really the most sort of scary indicator in this instance. Now, I think I see this in connection with the president's recent statement about his own persona, right? That I could be either A or B, the president or the defense secretary. So, like a very sort of a threatening sort of assertion of his dual persona, right? And so I think that it is all related to that kind of sort of emphasis of the fact that nobody can question a position that the government has taken. So other than the issue of the cremations itself, or the cremation versus burial issue itself, the fact of this assertion of authority, regardless of anybody saying anything, is I think the issue that is of most concern for me. Okay. So my point is that we might have to sort of rethink the way in which we do our activism and politics in view of this position that has been asserted, right? So it doesn't seem to be, if there is sort of a strong public reaction, that the government will respond to that. That doesn't seem to be the way things will work henceforth. Okay, now I want to shift now to make a different point. So now there has been a lot of writing on the issue of the cremation versus burial, and there's been a lot of sympathetic sort of assertion of the pain that Muslim communities facing, and the sort of the wound that they seem to be carrying, right? So this was really welcomed by a lot of Muslim activists and all of that, and even I very greatly appreciate the amount of writing that has been going on in that vein. But there's also something quite curious in that writing that I want to sort of draw attention to, which is that there's a way in which sociological explanations for the sort of the predicament of the Muslims is being sought in a variety of ways without actually paying too much attention to the history of Muslim politics or the history of sort of the state's engagement with Muslim communities, right? So there is a way in which the story about minorities in Sri Lanka is being told through one frame only, right? The sort of the assertion of Tamil nationalism and the sort of the radicalization of Tamil youth and the growth of a violent resistance movement as a result of Tamil identity politics. It seems to be the sort of the frame through which even the sort of the circumstances that brought or brought this particular state of affairs with regards to Muslims is being understood. So the reason I started with the history of the anti-Muslim movement was also to sort of draw attention to the fact that the way in which this the story of these two minorities can be told are quite different, and it's important that we understand this specificity because it will inform the way in which we do politics in the future, right? So the one thing that I want to point to is the way in which the voting in parliament in support of the 20th Amendment was understood. Now, the 20th Amendment was passed with the participation or with 7 Muslim MPs, 6 or 7 Muslim MPs voting in favor, right? So the government needed 150 and they got about 154. And for that, so the sort of the narrative is being formed that it couldn't have won or passed the 20th Amendment without the support of the Muslim MPs. Right. So now, of course, obviously, it was not only Muslim MPs that voted for it. There's this whole string of Sinhala MPs. And, you know, if you want to go down the ethnic specificity path, there were many different groups that voted for it. Right. But there is this rhetoric of how the Muslims voted for it, despite the fact that the government is, you know, really marginalizing them and really marginalizing minorities anyway. Right. So now the point is this. Now the Muslim MPs who voted for the 20th Amendment are from 2 minor Muslim parties or 2 Muslim parties with minimal representation actually of the Muslim population. And this is what I mean by that. They are from, you know, particular districts, right, that are outside of the southern sort of concentration of Muslim population. And this hasn't been sort of talked about enough, right? So the Muslim ethnic identity assertion through politics has only been centrally in the north and east, with some representation in the central province also, with Rauf Hakim, for instance, in the central province, right? And so Rauf Hakim and maybe one other person in the central province. So the fact that the entire Muslim social formations voting pattern is attributed to the voting pattern of only a particular particular minority among the Muslim community is a very interesting phenomenon that we need to sort of be a little bit more cognizant of and be aware of when we talk about our politics, right? Or when we talk about, when we sort of organize or you know, do activism around it. Now, then the other issue is that they are also being talked about, like for instance, the behavior of the Muslim politicians is being talked about by writers as the responsibility of the entire Muslim community, right? Or the Muslim population of 2 million people. Now, for instance, there was one writer who wrote about it in these terms. Let me see if I have that here. Okay, no, I can't. I thought I'd written it down, but I can't find it. But basically, that like Kishali Pinto Jayawardena, for instance, was talking about how it was the 20th Amendment, voting for the 20th Amendment was a Faustian bargain that was made by the Muslim community and its political representation. So now this is patently wrong, because the representatives there who voted for the 20th Amendment are not representative of the entire Muslim community. Now, this is very clear if you take a quick look. For instance, I mean, the numbers of Muslim representation in the other parties is quite high, and they were not part of the coalitions that voted for the 20th Amendment. Right? So there is no understanding of that in the way in which this analysis is done. Now, so I find that sort of a problem, because, you know, when you're trying to understand the predicament of the Muslim community in Sri Lanka at this current moment, if you don't understand it in terms of, you know, the large plurality, right? The large sort of like diversity within the Muslim community, I think you will get the analysis wrong. Now, this is also important because, you know, in talking about the Easter Sunday attacks and, you know, what is behind the Easter Sunday attacks, there is a constant reference to Muslim identity politics and also to Muslim religious reformist mobilization. Right? So if you don't understand religious reformist mobilization as something about personal piety and not really about sort of like politically organizing as a community, then you get the whole analysis wrong. And I think this is really problematic when we are trying to sort of understand what exactly is going on. So now, I mean, I realize that this is not directly speaking to the crisis that Sri Lanka is facing right now with the sort of authoritarian government and the sort of the crisis in the economy and all of that. But I think going forward, if we are going to have a substantive analysis of the problems that the country is facing and think about solutions, I think it is important that we have a sense of who the Muslims are in Sri Lanka, what is their history, and how do we understand sort of, political mobilization of Muslims, and also the sort of the violent mobilization that is also, quite possible in this given context. Now, I'm going to end now. Now, Nirmala said that, she sees that this is like kind of, very sort of, sense of deja vu. And I was also thinking about that now. In 1977, after the violence, after the elections of 1977, when the government let the anti-Tamil violence take place for about a month, J.R. Jayawardena in Parliament stated that, people get angry, and I'm paraphrasing here, people get angry with the Tamil parliamentarians who ask for non-violence by threatening violence. Because the Tamil parliamentarians were saying that if solutions are not found to these problems, their youth will get radicalized towards violence, and that they want to stop that, right? So it's as if we are in that moment again with regards to the Muslims here. Hilmi Ahmad and a friend of mine and an activist recently stated in a public statement on Facebook and on Twitter, I think, and it was carried in a news bulletin as well, that he is convinced that the government is actually trying to incite violence among youth in the Muslim community, right? So this is kind of the sort of the dire status of things in Sri Lanka with regards to minorities. So in that context, I think it is important also as activists and as sort of academics that we get our analysis of the problem and understanding of what is going on right as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fara. Thank you, Fara. I think what we will do is we will have the discussion at the end because we want to sort of carry on with the meeting. I just wanted to make a tiny little comment. I also said this about a sense of deja vu because of the way in which the Muslim community is being scapegoated as this sort of, ascribing all kinds of evil motives to Muslims. And the same thing happened to the Tamils in the late 70s and the early 80s, fabricating lies about, for instance, the Dr. Shafi case. We had similar things happening to various Tamils about education and all of that. So I know many in the audience might have heard of the Dr. Shafi case that happened two years ago. But anyway, so that also, it's really very upsetting to hear the same thing being enacted again. I now call upon Swasthika Arulingam, who is a lawyer and is a member of the Liberation Movement, a left feminist movement of women in Sri Lanka. They organized a really good campaign against forced cremations of Muslims recently. As a lawyer, she works with people arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act and has been campaigning for the repeal of anti-terror legislation, including the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And she's been campaigning, there's another piece of legislation that the government is proposing. She has been campaigning against that as well. And also, I must add, Swasthika was here a few years ago as a postgraduate student, and she was active with South Asia Solidarity Group then, and has spoken at our meetings before. Thank you, Swasthika, for agreeing to speak today. Okay.
Thank you, Manasa. I would, in my short presentation, I will be actually touching and maybe building on some of the things which Nirmala said, as well as some of the things which Farzana said. But basically, I would be focusing on talking about certain events and issues which I have witnessed in the past 2 years while I worked as in my profession as a lawyer, which I also think is very emblematic of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, not only under this government, but also under the previous government. So soon after the April 2019 Easter Sunday attack happened, and now we know that many people in power, including members of the current government, were directly or indirectly they have contributed to the violent events which happened during Easter Sunday attacks, which killed more than 250 people and injured many others. So anyway, soon after the Easter Sunday attacks, one of the things the government did immediately was to scapegoat the Muslim community and create this psyche within the general population of Sri Lanka that it was the entire Muslim community who was somehow responsible for this Easter Sunday attack. And the Easter Sunday attack was carried out by terrorists, and therefore the Muslim community also consists of large terrorists. So this idea was created amidst the population of Sri Lanka. So like we were sitting and watching the TV, and within a few weeks time, the government managed to show on television how they raided Muslim houses. Like it was like watching a nightmarish circus where the police would go about raiding Muslim houses, arresting people for possessing Arabic literature, for updating status updates, for possessing swords. Mosques were being raided, and then these were like produced on television as production for the viewing of the general public. And I think in the early stages, soon after the Easter Sunday attack, almost more than 1,800 Muslims were arrested in the first few weeks. So being terror suspects, I felt was something, this is my experience of course, I felt was something very new to the Muslim community, because when the arrest started happening, many families frantically called lawyers like myself who have been working on prevention of terrorism or other anti-terror cases. And they called us and asked us, can you do something? Can you check up on our family members? The CID has arrested them and so on. The Terrorist Investigation Division officers have arrested them. So I think after several years, I actually visited the CID building. And the Terrorist Investigation Division building, which is situated in Colombo, is like when you enter the building, it has this very eerie dark corridor. So you have to go through that corridor to enter the building. So between 2013 and 2015, when I used to visit this building to inquire about suspects who have been arrested under the anti-terror laws, the corridors was always filled with Tamil families, anxiously waiting to hear what has happened to their detained relatives. And fast forward to 2019, when I visited the TI building that day, it was filled with Muslim families just waiting to hear what has happened to the people who have been detained. And this image kind of stayed with me for several reasons, because soon after the war, I mean, my memory of politics only is very this thing only soon after the war, because I actually entered political activism during that time. So soon after the war, there was this racist narrative being drummed, or even during the war, there was this racist narrative being drummed up against Tamils. So the Tamils equals the LTT, and the LTT equals terrorists. So therefore, all Tamils were terrorists. And therefore, when a Tamil person gets arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, he is already deemed guilty by the larger society, which also includes the legal system. Once the person comes under the anti-terror laws, then it's almost as if it's like an uphill task to prove his innocence. And post Easter Sunday attack, this was a similar situation which many Muslims who were arrested under anti-terror laws found themselves in. And like I have been watching, like many people have been watching, the Sri Lankan authoritarian government for several decades have conveniently scapegoated minorities, particularly when there is a political and economic crisis which they are unable to handle, or when they are losing popularity with the Sinhala majority in the south. And today the scapegoated community is the Muslim community by and large. And this persecution of the Muslim community continues till today. Last year, lawyer Hijaz Hizbullah was arrested, and he has been representing several Muslims in several court cases, and he was picked up by the state and he's still in detention. Ramzi Razik was arrested. He was an activist, and he was arrested for using the word jihad in the context of fighting against racism on Facebook, and he was kept in detention for several months. A poet named Anaf has been still in detention for writing against the ISIS, and the state basically arrested him because they discovered this book, and the book was written in Tamil, and they could not read what this poet has written. Similarly, in 2019, Dilshan Muhammad was arrested because the state could not read his status updates, which was basically telling Muslim youth to not go down the path radicalism and so on, and violence and so on. So there have been people arrested within the Muslim community because the government could not understand what they have been writing. And ironically, they have been writing in the Tamil language, which is one of the national languages of Sri Lanka. Moving on to quite a different thing is what happened during the lockdown when the COVID crisis struck Sri Lanka in early 2020. And as you know, all across the world, governments were opting for lockdowns because that was one of the only ways in which you can control the pandemic. In Sri Lanka, we have a legal system where we can put the lockdown. We have the public security ordinance. We have the quarantine and prevention diseases ordinance, under which the government can put legal curfews and lockdowns. However, the Rajapaksa government always tries to have a different flavor to everything. So, in an unprecedented move, they imposed a lockdown in Sri Lanka, which was not governed by any laws. The Human Rights Commission called this lockdown an illegal lockdown. So they imposed a lockdown which was not backed or which was not based upon any law, and took this extra legal measure. And what was dangerous was that under this illegal lockdown, there were nearly 66,000 people arrested and produced in court under no law and were bailed out under no law. So we sort of had this emperor's new clothes kind of situation where we all knew that this curfew existed, but we all accepted that this curfew existed, but no one really knew where this curfew was coming from, because there was no law backing the curfew, and no one knew under what law these people who were being arrested under this illegal curfew were being produced and bailed out, because there was no law to back it. So what I felt was the Rajapaksas were once again Rajapaksa type of rule. They were telling us that they were above the law, that they were beyond the law. They're not bound by the law. And this time around, I felt we all kind of allowed it to happen, because we all told ourselves, well, this is COVID pandemic, we need to have a lockdown, so we don't want to question the curfew. But in effect, what we have done is we have allowed this new precedent to set in place, where a government can place an entire country under lockdown without having any legal basis or without having any legal backing. And then we come to the point of who was actually affected by this illegal lockdown. Many families like myself went into comfortable lockdowns because we were financially okay. We were doing okay even under the lockdown. But there were many people, particularly in marginalized sections of society. There were migrant workers who had come to urban areas to work. There were plantation workers who were not given work. There were daily wage earners and garment factory workers. And we would get calls from activists and from social workers who have been working very closely with these families, telling us that families have not eaten for several days. They have been surviving on plain tea, and the children were starving. So if we can do something to collect rations. And the government had a very, I would say, a very bad system of looking after these families and so on. But even for that poor system, even the little assistance they gave to these families, even that did not go to the most marginalized, because for administrative reasons, like they were not registered with the Gram Sevaka, so therefore they could not get the assistance. So the most marginalized was the most affected during the lockdown, and I think it is similar in the rest of the world, but it is the same situation in Sri Lanka. Similarly, you found migrant workers who have been working in the Middle Eastern countries, and the government was completely riling up the narrative that the migrant workers were COVID infected. If we need to bring them here, then the COVID would start spreading and we won't be able to control it. So therefore, we can't bring them back now. And over 60 migrant workers have died abroad because of COVID. And still, the government has been very slow in acting in bringing these migrant workers back to Sri Lanka. So in summary, what I want to say is during the COVID crisis, we all allowed this lockdown to happen because we all thought it was necessary. But inevitably, what we have also done is we have allowed the government to also put democratic activities, put dissent under lockdown, and we have allowed the government to almost put human rights behind bars, and the symptoms of which is exploding right now in the recent prison riots, which basically the prisoners were rioting because they were afraid that they would get infected with COVID, because the prisons are like a hotbed, and if one gets affected, it's just going to spread. So they were protesting, and 8 prisoners died, and over 16 males were injured. And a second wave of COVID crisis has taken off, starting from Gandhi's garment factory, affecting over 1,000 garment factory workers. And to date, this bandit is yet to be held accountable for how this came to be and how the second wave of COVID actually started from this bandit cluster, and which the government has done very little to control. That's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Swastika. I'm sure there'll be many more questions for both you and Fara after Ahilan finishes. Now I ask Ahilan Kadirgamar to speak. He's a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology, University of Jaffna. He is a fortnightly columnist in the Daily Mirror in Sri Lanka and a contributing editor of Himal South Asian magazine. He also regularly writes on the political economy of Sri Lanka and post-war issues in forums such as The Hindu in India. His research interests include the post-war reconstruction of the North, rural indebtedness, and the cooperative movement. He is a member of the Jaffna People's Forum for Coexistence and also a member of the Collective for Economic Democracy in Sri Lanka. Ahilan Kadirgamar.
Thank you. So I've been asked to talk about the economic context for what's going on politically and in terms of human rights, which Fara and Swastika talked about. Currently, Sri Lanka by far is going through its worst economic crisis, perhaps since the 1930s, when the world was hit by the Great Depression. And at that time also in Sri Lanka in the mid-1930s, there was a malaria crisis that affected close to 1 million people. But that had various consequences. And it's important to, I think, understand the historical context of the current crisis. So I'll be also talking a little bit about that. But at the current moment, Sri Lanka is severely in a balance of payment crisis. In other words, we do not have the foreign reserves to pay for imports or to pay back our loans. So import restrictions have been brought about, but at the same time, the question of whether Sri Lanka would be able to repay its foreign debt, which amounts to something like 4.5 billion US dollars every year for the next few years. On the domestic front, we are also going through a fiscal crisis in the sense that revenues have greatly fallen. On the average, Sri Lanka's state expenditure, which is actually quite low, is about 20% of GDP. But in 2020, our revenues fell below 10% of GDP. It is in this kind of context that there's been very little relief on the part of the Sri Lankan government for those who have been affected by the COVID crisis. And as Swastika mentioned, it's the informal sector, the day wage earners that are most affected, and there's been very little relief on the part of the government. But how did we get here? Because Sri Lanka has a very different history when we look at its economy. Following the Great Depression and the malaria crisis, the left became much stronger in Sri Lanka. And along with that, progressive forces instituted free education policies, free healthcare policies, food subsidies in the 1940s and 50s from the late colonial period soon into independence. And I would argue that to this day, education, which is free all the way up to university, is one of our strongest strengths. And even the way in which we've been able to deal with the COVID crisis has greatly benefited from our free healthcare system. And right now, there's a lot of concern about not just poverty, but food security and malnutrition and so on. And here again, in 1953, when there was the major food crisis, when the government at the time raised the price of rice threefold, it led to perhaps the biggest protest in Sri Lanka, which Sri Lanka did something that no other country did, that between 1953 and 1983, in the course of 3 decades, our self-sufficiency in rice went up from 25% to 90%. In other words, the protest sent such a shock through the successive governments that they had to increase rice production. And that is again one of the strengths, that in the sense that even today we are probably more or less self-sufficient in rice, which is our staple. But while in the 1970s we were considered a model development state along with Cuba, in other words, despite having very low per capita income, our human development indicators were quite high. In 1977, from the import substitution regime, Sri Lanka shifted towards neoliberal policies, what we call the open economic policies here, which led to Sri Lanka becoming one of the first countries in South Asia to become liberalized. And that has had its toll. While there was an initial boom with capital flowing in, as the economic crisis deepened in the early 1980s, when the initial boom petered out, was also a time when there was the repression of the labor movement, the general strike in 1980, which was crushed by the JR regime, and eventually increased use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And I would argue that this also added to the 1983 July pogrom and the beginning of the civil war. So there is an economic dimension to the various kind of conflicts and the repression by the state historically. And while during the war, liberalization went forward at a slower pace, after the war in 2010, there was as if a second wave of neoliberalism, where there was investment and consumption binge on foreign debt, which led to the beautification of Colombo. Sri Lanka's, the Sri Lanka's leaders, the Rajapaksa regime that was in power then, while on the one hand talking about sovereignty, they were floating billions of dollars in sovereign bonds in the capital markets around the world. And that led to the kind of foreign debt crisis, which was continued by the Wickremesinghe Sirisena government as well. So the last decade, increased integration with global finance has been a really important factor in where we stand economically. There's a lot of attention on the role of China and maybe India, but I think often the role of global finance in Sri Lanka is not mentioned or underestimated. It's in this kind of a context that with the failures of the previous government and the re-emergence of the Rajapaksa regime, which was backed by ex-military actors, a class of the business elite, technocrats, and Sinhala Buddhist nationalist elements, that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected, but with on a platform claiming that through these technocratic measures and neoliberal policies that they would be able to revive the economy and bring prosperity to Sri Lanka. A few months after he was elected, the pandemic hit. Already the economy was going south, and very quickly accelerated the crisis, where in 2020, I think when the data comes out, we're looking at an unprecedented contraction of our economy, anywhere from 6 to 10%. And with that, the kind of added economic suffering. So this, but while this crisis has been hitting Sri Lanka, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric locally by the government and various ministers about some kind of a return to the 1970s, that perhaps we could go back to that import substitution regime. Definitely they've been restricting imports. So that was to be watched for. But the budget announced the budget for 2021 announced in November showed no signs of it. If you look at the allocations for 2021, and now the budget estimates are on the Finance Ministry's website, it's very clear that the policies, it's as if the pandemic did not happen. It's as if we have rewound to late 2019, and we are just putting forward a budget like any other year with infrastructure development, for example, out of the 1 billion rupees in public investment, which provides the direction of government economic investment. 350 million is for the Ministry of Highways. 350 billion rupees out of close to 1,000 billion rupees. 100 billion rupees for water supply to make a business out of it. So there's very little, and if you look at social welfare spending, it's actually been brought down for 2021, and it's only going to be about 186 billion, half the amount that we will be spending on highways. So clearly, in terms of the direction of the government, there is no rethinking at all. And it's in this kind of a context that Sri Lanka is sort of going with a begging bowl to China, to India, to any power, and beggars, I suppose, can't be choosers. So they're willing to take any kind of investment and capital from any actor. But as we look at the global data, it's quite clear that very few actors are going to be there to provide foreign direct investment and so on. So how they're going to get out of this crisis on the external front, in other words, how are they going to get the capital to be able to roll over and repay the loans and to continue with importing essentials is in question. Secondly, the budget provides no leeway towards addressing domestic investment or expenditure. In other words, there's no change in tax policy. Many looked for the possibility of a wealth tax, because during a contracting economy, incomes and profits are going to be low. So the only way to do it would be to redistribute. There was no sign of that. And all of this in a time when geopolitical maneuvers around Sri Lanka and the region are increasing, where Sri Lanka could get caught in this kind of a problem of getting into others' conflicts. So I just want to finish by talking about two broad concerns. How do we look at the kind of internationalization of Sri Lanka in this context, and some few thoughts to add to Fara and Swasthika about national politics. Internationally, as I mentioned, we desperately need economic support. Otherwise, we are looking at a very serious crisis, and that's going to affect the population as a whole. So there needs to be some kind of a safe landing, and it looks very difficult, but that will be in the interest of the people. In terms of the rights issues, I think solidarity is always needed, but on a very principled manner. My worry is that, as in the past, the rights concerns, economic concerns here would be used for geopolitical interests by the larger powers, and that in turn would only polarize actors within Sri Lanka, and as it did a decade ago, can also strengthen the authoritarian regime. So to figure out a way in which solidarity stays clear of the kind of geopolitical interests of the larger powers. And I think that's something for all of us to think about. In terms of national politics, clearly this is a moment when the regime and various other actors are using a kind of very aggressive, muscular kind of nationalist mobilization that we are seeing not only in Sri Lanka, but in the region. And it's very important to call out nationalism on all sides, because the extremes feed on each other. Sinhala Buddhist nationalism has always kind of fed on narrow Tamil nationalism. And the scary version now is that with polarization fed at the center, different actors can also become polarized at the periphery. Even within the Tamil polity, there could be polarization. There could be polarization between the Tamil and Muslim communities, because that is the kind of the logic of nationalism and polarization. The other major concern, I think, the platform on which for us to think of solidarity, as Fara so put it well, there's need for solidarity with the Muslim community. I would argue that in addition to the kind of mobilization locally, global Islamophobia has fed into this. But we also have to be careful not to just use the various tropes, but to really understand the history of the Muslim community when we're thinking about solidarity. And that solidarity to be also linked to a sense of Sri Lanka's democracy, which is currently under attack. I would argue that at this moment, defending democracy, strengthening the liberal center is of utmost importance, because various cultural fascist forces are starting to gain ground, and the danger of fascism is becoming a real concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahilan. That was really great. You did a really sort of a sweep of how we should look at Sri Lanka in its broadest context, economic and political context. I now open the webinar for questions. We have a couple of questions already. The first one is, this is for Fara or Swasthika maybe, or anyone can answer this. How can the cremation policy be fought against, given the Sri Lankan state will not listen to its own expert committee? That's one question about the forced cremations. The second one is to Ahilan specifically. Given Sri Lanka's economic crises, are there economic levers that international community, including Western states, can use to push for human rights? What are ethical and responsible ways to engage in this type of advocacy, especially from the context of the diaspora and the need for economic support? I mean, this question is going to be sort of a, what shall I say, consistent theme in SASG's Sri Lanka meetings, I think. But, you know, because we are in the diaspora and we are working from abroad, and we want to give solidarity, as all three of you have said. But these are the two questions that have come up, but we expect more questions to come. Okay. Do you want to start, Fara?
Okay, so for me, it's a bit of a difficult question. When I was asked this a couple of months ago as to what could be done, I asked for a committee to look at it and give a report on sort of the science versus, you know, the cultural requirements of communities and all of that. So, well, that's been done now. That's been done, and it has been rejected by the government. So, I think it's a huge issue that I really don't know what the answer is to that question as to how we can have the government address it. I think I mean, I'm not very supportive of this position, but I'll say it since it, came up. But I think it would just, for now, I think we would just have to leave it. And I think we would have to depend on sort of the goodwill politics, or doing goodwill politics to bring about a change if we want it. I think right now it feels like we have exhausted all possible means of actually doing action and bringing it forward. So yeah, I think it's a crisis, and the real answer is that I don't know.
Anybody else? How can the cremation policy be fought against, given the Sri Lankan state will not listen to its own expert committee?
I don't have a different answer to Fara.
Yes.
I think but answering it a little, not answering it, but thinking about it a little differently. I think one of the things which have come out of this cremation, this issue affecting Muslim communities is that in many of the protests which happened across North and the East, for the first time I saw Tamils also joining in protests affecting the Muslim community, and I think that's like a small sign of solidarity which is forming between Tamils and Muslim, however weak it may be. So that is just like something apart, but I don't have an answer to the question.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, can I just say, so no, I think that's a really great point. And I think it's also sort of the mobilization for resistance, right? I think that is the main thing that has come out of it, that it's a strategy to resist. But I think if we are talking about the fact of somehow achieving what we are trying to achieve through that mobilization, I think we are not going to. But I think the strategy to resist and to sort of like constantly question that momentum that it has gotten, I think should be sustained. So.
I just wanted to highlight, I think there was also the start of many Muslim families, especially the poor ones, because the government insisted on them paying for the coffins and for the funeral when they were going to cremate them anyway. And Muslim families in frustration said, we don't want to participate in your cremation rites of our loved ones. You do it yourself, and you keep the ashes. We don't want the ashes. What can we do with the ashes? And I know that this started, and there were people who were talking about this should become a point of civil disobedience by the Muslim community. I think, yeah, I don't know whether you have any comment on that, but anyway, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very powerful moment of civil disobedience. But I think, I think in your Pingal Samdipu, there was a discussion, and Shreen was pointing to the fact that many of the people who had done that were having really difficult times getting moving on from the death of a loved one, right? So I'm not necessarily sort of committed to that project. I mean, I recognize the moment, or recognize the place from which that emerged, right? Or from great pain and great sort of distress. But I think, I mean, it's not a long-term kind of a sustainable way of protesting, I think, even for the families. So yeah, so I have some certain reservations about that.
Right. Ahilan, do you want to deal with that? You can see the question, can't you? You can.
Sure.
Yeah, if you want to, because the next question, I think, from Satish Kumar Balasundaram, maybe Fara and Swasthika, and all three of you can answer. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah, Ahilan, thank you.
Yeah, on the question of economic levers by international actors, I am skeptical, and I would say I'm also worried that such economic levers would be used on Sri Lanka. As I mentioned, I see solidarity on the rights front should be principled. When geopolitical powers start to meddle in Sri Lanka, it actually ends up aggravating the situation. If you look at Sri Lanka historically, internationalization on the political front, and for that matter, the economic front, has only made things worse. And even at the start of the conflict, Indian influence and so on only aggravated the situation. In other words, if we are to move out of this situation that we are in right now, as Fara mentioned, I also felt it was quite heartening to see even the gains that were made against the forced cremation in terms of ideologically, the kind of way in which sections of the majority community were also slowly starting to shift. This is going to be, this is not, the shift is not going to happen in a few months. It's going to take time, but the only way forward is to build stronger relationships between the minority communities and the Sinhala community. And that is a struggle within Sri Lanka. Of course, there needs to be solidarity, but solidarity that is very conscious of how that can be done. And I think as the year and next year move on, the economic problems, as they become aggravated, the regime and the state might try to deflect that by further inflaming ethnic tensions and conflicts and so on. But and that's a very difficult situation that we have to wade through in trying to find common ground among the communities to take up, for example, the economic issues. And if economic levers are used, that would actually make that kind of solidarity that much harder. I don't think any kind of international intervention is going to come and save Sri Lanka. Ultimately, if you're talking about democracy in Sri Lanka, it has to be movements from within, and that's going to take time, but that's the only way forward. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to say something. I mean, the next question is from Satish Kumar Balasundaram, and maybe Fara, you want to have a go at this first. I guess it could be said that since 1948, the minority communities have been agitating for change. What, if any, movements are emerging within the Sinhalese community for inclusivity and change within the Sri Lankan political establishment? Is there anything emerging within the majority community for inclusivity, basically kind of reaching out, like a pro-minority position, basically? I don't know.
Farah, I think you're muted.
Oh, Farah.
Yeah. No, I think there has always been assertions of solidarity, right? I mean, in relation to the crises that minorities have faced, there have always been assertions of solidarity. But I think there are certain issues around which there are difficulties in articulating sort of the minority experience in a context where the experience is not necessarily shared, right? So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to go in Sri Lanka's sort of among Sri Lanka's progressives that understands what majoritarian privilege actually means and what listening to minorities means, right? I think I really want to recognize the solidarity that has been shown across the years, okay? But also emphasize that there is still more work that is required, because I think some of us have experienced working with Sinhala allies, right? That, there are certain points at which, we can't go forward. For instance, I mean, in relation to like the Muslim issue, right? There's a sort of, everyone knows about how Muslims function, right? That's as if, that's like sort of, the kind of the ethos that we have inherited from like global Islamophobia informs all our thinking, okay? And so that is how a lot of people, even allies, seem to respond in certain ways. So what I'm saying is that there needs to be a little bit more attention paid to the experience of minorities and also the attention paid to the pain, right? And I think this is true of, appreciating the Tamil experience and now the Muslim experience, that I felt always that, while there's great allyship, right? And there's great solidarity, there are certain moments at which there is a breakdown of relating to certain experiences. So for me, I think that is something that, among progressives in Sri Lanka, that a little bit more thought into the privilege of being a part of the majority needs to be taken on board. But I want to emphasize that, I think many of the politics that we engage in and take forward really requires the solidarity that has been shown by Sinhala identified activists, right? And I would really like to value that also. I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is from Savitri Hensman. What possibilities do speakers see of joint action on economic issues among people from different ethnic and religious communities and geographical regions who are badly served by the current regime on economic issues? Does anyone want to have a go?
Yeah, maybe I'll just start and then others could add. I think this is an important moment in Sri Lanka's history for our trade unions, for social movements. For example, I work quite a bit with the cooperatives in the north, because there is also, even as we are facing the pandemic, even as we are facing repression, there is clearly a shift in the economy. There's a shift towards the rural. And in that kind of a context, when there is a kind of a economic shift happening, how are these kinds of institutions, social institutions, going to work with the people, provide an economic alternative that the government has clearly failed, and that's most clear from the budget for 2021 and even their kind of vocal policies. But and to be able to do that, if they have to put forward an alternate vision, and that alternate vision should be able to bring together the minorities and the majority community, understanding the kind of the class cleavages and the kind of the class character of the regime, and to be able to bring resistance forward given the deepening economic crisis. Now, even our trade unions, even our movements with a long protracted conflict have become more ethnicized. So whether they would be able to change that direction, and whether new actors would emerge into that space. I think what happened with the ethnic conflict is that trade unions, political activists all turned to look at the ethnic issue, and the kind of class concerns were neglected. So this time around, it's important to tie the kind of resistance to repression of minorities to these kinds of class concerns, even as the economy is in free fall. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. The next question, quite a few, still 3 more questions to go. I hope we can go a little past 4:30. We were. So the next one is from Kumaran Nadesan. I'm wondering if all the panelists can share their thoughts on how the current economic crisis, worsening authoritarian actions against subnational communities, and constitutional reform, within inverted commas, will have implications, if any, at the upcoming session of the UNHRC on post-war justice and accountability measures, or if geopolitics will continue to serve their economic interests in Sri Lanka and relegating accountability to the back burner. I think Ahilan has dealt with this in different ways, and we may talk about this in greater detail at our next session on Sri Lanka. But still, if somebody wants to go on it very briefly, the panelists, you can see the question, can't you? It's a very longly worded question, yeah. If you can be brief about it, because there are a couple of other questions about what the diaspora solidarity can mean, yeah.
I think one point I want to highlight in relation to this is the importance of what's going to happen constitutionally with respect to the 13th Amendment. I mean, the government is talking about constitutional change. They've already brought about the 20th Amendment, which has heaped huge amount of powers in the executive presidency, effectively, consolidating the authoritarian power that they wanted. the 13th Amendment and devolution is very much a part of the democratization process in Sri Lanka. I don't see anything progressive coming out of any kind of constitutional reform in the next few years, but there are very serious dangers that devolution would be undermined, and finding a way to stop the attack on devolution and the 13th Amendment, I think, is perhaps one of the most critical things politically that Sri Lankan, progressives and those in solidarity with Sri Lanka have to think about.
Thanks. The next one is, I don't know.
There's a question from Sumadi a little bit higher up in the list.
Oh, right. Okay. I see. You want to read it and answer it, Fara? I saw it, but I missed the question. Now I can't see it. Can you
want to ask it?
Can you read the question out?
I think Sumadi wants to ask it. She said she's like thinking it through.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that's possible. But shall we deal with this very little question about and while she Sumadi, you can be next to ask the question. But this is from Sugi Chandra Mohan. Some view that Sri Lanka is handling the corona crisis well in terms of its spread and the number of deaths. What's your view? I think Swasthika touched on how Sri Lanka is handling the coronavirus, the pandemic through militarization. But do you care to elaborate on that? Because Sri Lanka has very small number of deaths compared to us in Britain. We are like 1,300, 1,400 people dying every day at the moment. So everybody is praising Sri Lanka here, not the Sri Lankan national, Sri Lankan diaspora, but others. Oh, you come from this wonderful country. They have controlled the number of deaths. What do you think, Swasthika?
I don't think we should measure the government's success based on the number of deaths. I think we should measure success on many fronts. One of the things, because like we are living in Sri Lanka, we can talk about this. One of the things about the COVID crisis is that, I don't know if many people know this, but people are afraid to get PCR tested, because if they get PCR tested and they're found positive, and many people believe that during the second wave of COVID, they might have got infected, that they would end up in quarantine centers, and they would have to go through the horrific conditions which we have seen in quarantine centers. So the way in which the COVID crisis has been handled, the way in which the COVID crisis task force headed by military personnel, the way in which the COVID crisis has been handled as a military operation as opposed to a health crisis, I think that is what measures whether the Sri Lankan government has in fact succeeded in, definitely not in the second wave, but whether the Sri Lankan government has actually handled it well. And my impression, and the impression of many other people, is that it has not handled well, and we should not measure it by the number of deaths in Sri Lanka, and the fact that we have not had so many deaths, because there is so many other fronts. We don't know how many people are in fact infected with this COVID virus, and the government suddenly, the government officials suddenly walk and conduct a random PCR test, and people are terrified. They just walk into markets and conduct a random PCR test. People don't want to be tested because they are afraid of going into these quarantine centers. There is very little lack of information. So my opinion is that you should measure the success of how a government is dealing with COVID crisis based on how they have dealt with information sharing, how they have dealt with controlling the pandemic, and so on. It's not on the number of deaths, it's not on the number of active cases, and so on.
Hi, thank you, Swasthika. Hi, Sumadi, you can't, you have to type your question because it's the webinar format, and we can't unmute you it's not, that facility is not there in this webinar format. Sorry, really sorry about that. Can you type your question? We have two more questions on what the diaspora can do. And so one is very quickly, and I think all three of you could answer this, please. And I'll quickly read them. And then one is from Rizwan Wahab. Mobilization of Tamils and Muslims against the diaspora expat community in UK and Canada to find a solution to issues faced by both Tamils and Muslims. How can the Solidarity Group, South Asian Solidarity Group, assist this? Maybe I will say something later on, I don't know, on behalf of South Asian Solidarity Group, to assist this, in collaborating with majority community in bringing about harmony. So this is basically the kernel of the question. And there's a question from Amal Abeyavardhana. The diaspora is sometimes viewed negatively. The Sri Lankan government sees it either as a source of investment. Is there a way of positively engaging stakeholders in Sri Lanka? Example, initiatives such as the Centenary Movement, too. Is there a way of building alliances across the diaspora that reaches different ethnicities, faiths, communities, and economic classes to support a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that can help heal the country after the conflict? I mean, these are very interesting questions, and I would really like to discuss with Amal Abeyavardhana and his group and with Rizwan Wahab ongoing throughout this year as a member of the diaspora and a member of South Asia Solidarity Group. But having said that, the panelists, can you just give us very brief thoughts on this, all three of you, please, on these two questions which seem to speak to the same thing, and of course, investment. How can the diaspora help with investment is also a question. Yes. Yeah, who wants to go first?
I'll say something really very short, which is that I think if you can, lead the way in collectively organizing and not sort of in terms of ethnic silos. There's a lot of organizing of, Muslim organizations in the UK, for instance. But I think it would be more powerful and more useful if there was a common, as the person is suggesting, that there was a common platform from which, recommendations, for instance, in relation to compulsory cremation, right? I mean, if that can come from a common platform, I think it would be much more powerful.
Common, yes, of course, I agree. I just want to say that, yeah, go ahead. I just say something to that. Swasthika, about, I mean, you've been here and worked with SSG, and so Ahilan also has been involved with solidarity work from abroad before, many years ago. So maybe you can give us some thoughts, yes, briefly, possible.
This is in general, I mean, not in terms of the work in general, it's that I tell this a lot to my diaspora friends, is that when they do politics in the diaspora, they have to be responsible, particularly under a government such as this, because it can really backfire here. It can really backfire and it can really affect people here. When you ask for information, when you do politics, when you do solidarity action, you should really check with people who are living here as to whether this is going to contribute or whether it's going to negatively affect the people who are living here. And sometimes, going by the Tamil experience, sometimes diaspora politics have been quite counterproductive to the little kind of solidarity and activism which we are trying to do here. That's just one thing I wanted to say.
Thank you. Yes, that's been my experience as well. Ahilan, please.
Yeah, no, I think I just want to echo what Fara and Swasthika said about solidarity from abroad being also multi-ethnic, that multi-ethnic forums, if working together there, and if we can bridge the gulf between the various communities in the diaspora, that would actually be a positive thing here. In addition, I want to say that solidarity has to be principled, and I think maybe that's where a group like SASG, in terms of we see the repression in India, so and in many parts of the world, and that's where trying to think that we can use large powers and leverage and so on to bring about change in a country like Sri Lanka often backfires. So to take it on a principled footing, given what's also happening in the global order, we're seeing not just polarization within Sri Lanka, but in the region and globally, and that's going to reflect on developments in Sri Lanka as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, about diaspora organizing, we are organizing in silos still. In my own comment is that there is quite a bit of, I mean, there is a bit of inter-ethnic solidarity. I mean, I know Amala, I know, I am involved with different communities, the different, being a Tamil with different communities in solidarity work in London, and there, but it's still very small. It's very, but the nationalism of the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, Tamil nationalism, and there isn't really a formed Muslim nationalism as such, but there are sort of Muslim feelings of being separate, and these have prevented us from building this solidarity movement in the diaspora. Sometimes in the diaspora, things are more acute actually with regard to Tamils and Sinhalese working together, and because so basically, yes, so this is something, and also I think Sri Lankans will have to think about the region as well. What is happening in India? What is happening in Pakistan? SASG is carrying on a very big campaign on India at the moment, and I really invite all those people here to attend our 24th January seminar, which will be really interesting. And you can see the parallels, you see the similarities, and you can see the different strategies of working in another country, which has very similar problems, even though we are very different in size and scale, etc., so on and so forth. Anyway, that's all I've got to say. And unfortunately, I haven't seen Sumati's comment yet. There is a comment to the panelists. It can sometimes be difficult to do inter-ethnic solidarity work. In 2005, I suggested a Sri Lankan Lawyers Association, including Sinhalese, Tamil, and Muslim lawyers, was laughed out of the room. I think this is Satish Kumar, who lives in Canada. He's a lawyer, and he wanted to probably work not as a Tamil lawyer, but but of course, so these are the difficulties. But anyway, having said that, any other questions? I'm just trying to check whether there are any other comments still left that we haven't. And then I will ask the panelists to make their last comments. It's been a very interesting meeting. Oh, yes, sorry. Can I just read this? Oh, right, okay. Can I just read this question from Siva Prakasam and Sridharan? There are, thinking globally, 50 Muslim majority countries. Muslims constitute about 24% of the total population of the world, I suppose. It is about 1,800 million, which is more than 100 times greater than the 16 million Sinhalese. Even considering South Asia, there are 600 million Muslim people are there. Can the Muslims of Sri Lanka bring the pan-Islamism for their defense in a destitute situation like this? This is from a Tamil man. So, okay. Obviously a lefty, but still I think his solution poses many problems for Muslims, I think. Anyway, Fara, you can tackle that question.
So there are two responses. One is that, when I was working with the Northern Muslim expulsion, people who were victimized by the Northern Muslim expulsion by the LTT in 1990. I mean, the story was that, you talk to the Muslim, embassies or whatever, and they will give you dates for Ramadan. That's it, right? The other story is that now, not a story, but now the development is that the Organization of Islamic countries or Islamic cooperation, I mean, that organization is a representative of a large number of Muslim majority countries, has responded and has been pressured by Sri Lankan Muslims, has responded and has made statements to the Sri Lankan government. So, I mean, that is also happening as part of strategies that Muslim community activists use in the context of, like Arulingam in the response to Arulingam, in the response to Digana, and even in relation to issue, I think. So that is happening, but I mean, again, like Ahilan was also saying, many of the problems that we are faced with are things that we have to find solutions to organizing locally. So while these can be, impact that it has, and not able to depend on, right? And yeah, so I'll stop there.
I think we will have, thank you. We will have one last question, which is sort of like a broad question. Do you think, from Redvi Silva, it is the failure of both liberal democracy and also the left that has given rise to nationalist authoritarianism? Who wants to have a go?
Yes and no, in the sense that there are many things that the left or the liberals could have done, for example, in Sri Lanka over the last 5 years to withstand this authoritarian nationalist turn. On the other hand, I think time and again, what we've seen is that nationalism is such a powerful force that it's able to mobilize, and that's where I would say that to be always be ready to challenge it at every point, and that it has the many ways of strengthening itself by othering and working with other nationalism. So to be also conscious that throughout our history and of the region and the globe, that nationalism, particularly during these kinds of moments of global economic crisis and so on, has time and again shown its capacity to mobilize in a very aggressive and muscular manner and succeed at its goals and bring about tremendous amount of destruction. So the failure of the left and the liberals might be that we did not create the kind of barriers and walls to be able to hold it back on the one hand. Thanks.
I just wanted to say some comments on the left in the south, because I live in Colombo and work with groups here. Is that there is a general idea or an understanding among the left that class is the main tension, and ethnicity and gender and all of that is just like minor issues which we can resolve if we deal with this class question. And wherever I go, wherever I speak, I say this, that you cannot build solidarity, you can't build solidarity even amongst the working class. If you're going to leave out large chunks of the population, if you're going to leave out women, if you're going to leave out the Tamils and Muslims. So I think in terms of the left in Sri Lanka, particularly in terms of the single left in Sri Lanka, there is not much of a conscience in terms of ethnicity, and there is not much of a conscience in terms of gender, despite the fact that we repeatedly hear not enough women participate in left politics. Tamils don't come into left in the southern left politics and so on. And that is because I think single left spaces consciously, by the way they handle politics, leave out minorities and leave out women and leave out marginalized communities. So that is something which in the past few years, which when talking about the current regime also, I think the rise of this current regime is also the failing of the left to not recognize ethnic differences, to not recognize ethnic questions which exist in Sri Lanka, to not recognize gender issues which exist in Sri Lanka. Therefore, splitting the working class and splitting the class politics, I would say.
Fara, do you want to say something? Something about failure of liberal democracy, maybe. I mean, I don't know.
No, I mean the nation state format, right, is in itself problematic, as Ahilan said. And so I would endorse what he said, and also I'm basically endorsing what Ahilan and Swasthika said, and I completely agree with Swastika's characterization of left politics in Sri Lanka, right? The left's inability to see the kind of crises that are brought about by Islamophobia, for instance, right? It has been a huge problem, and so then how do you build and sort of like broaden your understanding of even how class politics get manipulated two different kinds of tropes, right? In order to understand exactly what's happening in the world today. And I feel like they've failed at that. I mean, I don't want to sort of like overgeneralize. It's not everybody in the left, but I think that's a real problem.
Yeah, yes. I agree. I mean, I agree with all three panelists. It's the failure of the left in Sri Lanka is the biggest tragedy in my own political opinion, because they have this conversations between the different communities stopped. And of course, the Tamil and the Muslim community, they never had within their political formation big left, very, sort of large left segment in their political formation. So that's also, nationalism has always ruled. Yeah. So it's something that we have to think about in the future. Anyway, so I think we will now bring the meeting to an end, and I'm just trying to see whether there are any other questions that I have missed. But anyway, I think we have been here for about an hour and 45 minutes. We've had a really enjoyable discussion and wonderful speakers to listen to. Thank you very much to our three speakers, and I want everybody in the audience to remember the 24th January date and join us in our webinar on India. Thank you all for the discussion as well, the wonderful questions and all the answers that the panelists gave. And we shall carry on with our next session, hopefully in late February on Sri Lanka. Somebody has just written. Thank you very much. People are thanking us, the panelists. Thanks a lot then. Okay, so we will conclude the meeting here.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.